Our next speaker is Sally Mann, who was born in Lexington, Virginia, where she continues to live and work. She received a bachelor's in arts from Hollins College in 1974 and a master's in writing there the following year. She's always remained close to her roots. She's photographed the American South since the 1970s, producing series of works on portraiture, architecture, landscape, and still life. She's perhaps best known for her evocative and resonant landscape work in the American South and for intimate portraits of her family, her young children, and her husband. Her work has attracted controversy at times, as all good work usually does, but it's always been influential. And since the time of her first solo exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in 1977, she's attracted a wide audience. She's produced two major series of works on landscape, Deep South and Motherland. In What Remains, she assembled a 5-part study of mortality, ranging from pictures of the decomposing body of her greyhound to the bodies donated to the forensic study facility, commonly known as the Body Farm. Turning toward landscapes of death, she included a meditation on a site where an armed fugitive committed suicide on her property, segueing from that into a series of stirring and brooding images of the battlefields of the American Civil War. While Sally has experimented with color photography, she's always remained most interested in black and white, especially antique technology. She's long used an 8x10 bellows camera and has explored platinum and bromoil printing processes. In the mid-1990s, she began using the wet plate collodion process to produce pictures that appeared to be hybrids of photography, painting, and sculpture. Sally has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a 3-time recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. She was named America's Best Photographer by Time magazine in 2001. In May of 2011, she served as a prestigious speaker at Harvard University for the William E. Massey Senior Lecture in the History of American Civilization with a series entitled If Memory Serves. Every time I have had the pleasure to have a conversation with Sally, whether in a formal or informal setting, I'm struck by the depth and intensity with which she approaches life and her work. I honestly can't wait to hear what she has to say here today. Would you please give a warm welcome to Sally Mann?
Are we there? Wait, no, we're not. F5. Technology. Thank you, Eleanor. As I told you earlier, your show is spectacular, and I've read every page of that catalog and commend it to everybody here. It's so good. It's so smart. And Bill is a hard act to follow, I have to say. Eleanor mentioned the Massey lectures. I've expanded those into what will be, or seems to be, a book. And this is a chapter that I'm going to read to you from that book. Early in December 2000, when a convict came toward the house with his guns, I had already begun to think about the concept of death with a capital D, in relation to the land, as well as to photography and art. And as that awful day played out, I confess to thinking the timing of it had a perverse felicity, as if it were an apposite and propitious sign. That morning I was alone on the farm, the 6 greyhounds hanging out by the wood stoves while I spotted prints. I was listening to an audiobook of Moby Dick read by the late Frank Mueller, which was drowned out annoyingly by the sound of a helicopter repeatedly passing over the farm. When the phone rang, I put down the spotting brush and my eyes readapted to distance. I could see the copter hovering out over the river. It was my husband Larry on the line, and he sounded odd. He asked me if anyone was with me and said to answer carefully. Carefully? I said no, and he asked again if I was able to speak freely, and I, with some impatience, said, "Sure, of course I am. What the hell's up with you?" He let out a sigh and in a more normal voice told me that the sheriff had just called him at his office in town and asked him if I was home alone. Receiving the affirmative, he told Larry that an armed escapee was headed toward the house, and I needed to lock the doors. This was a laughable concept in a house with 9 unlockable French doors. Our home is protected entirely by geography. Sited on a raised plateau with long views and bounded on 3 sides by water, it is the classic stronghold. But Larry's imagination had gone to the unthinkable. The desperate man was already in, and I had a gun to my head. My own imagination also went into horror movie overdrive. I was certain I was hearing movement in the other room. I was. Pi, the youngest greyhound, was stretching and changing sides by the stove. I went back to the phone. Quickly, Larry explained the situation. A deputy had been sent to a residence on the other side of the county at 4 in the morning to arrest David Sensabaugh, who already had sex offenses on his record, for 4 new felony charges. A few hysterical women were at the scene, one rooting around in a shed for a gun. So the deputy cuffed Sensabaugh's hands behind his back and used the seatbelt to strap him to the front seat of the cruiser. While the deputy was distracted by the women screaming that he was a fat motherfucker and he was going to pay, Sensabaugh pretzeled his handcuffs wrist down and under his feet. He undid the seatbelt, locked the car doors, and rolled over to the driver's seat. Gunning the car, he tore off into a field, plowed a few unnecessarily exuberant donuts in the frozen dirt, took out a couple of fences, and cutting through a neighbor's side yard, hit the paved road and was gone. He went straight to a friend who hacksawed the handcuffs, then drove out our road, Route 39, ditched the car by the river, and set out on foot with a shotgun and 2 pistols. The deputies, joined by the state police with dogs, were in howling pursuit of him by mid-morning. But the fugitive knew the territory and mountain-goated down the cliffs above the Owari River. He crossed the cold river close to our cabin and spent some time there, drying himself before heading on a straight course toward our house. His pursuers, stymied by the cliffs and the river, doubled back in their cars and took the road to the nearest bridge. They were at least 15 minutes by car from our farm. As they set out, the circling helicopter pilot got a fix on Sensabaugh, heading toward the house, and radioed Sheriff Day, who called Larry. After I hung up, I rushed to the windows and, seeing no one, was convinced, like Larry, that he had already gotten in the house. Slinking along the walls, going from room to room like an absurdly imperiled cop in a house search, I cursed those damn greyhounds and their complete lack of guard dog protectiveness. Finding no one, I roused the dogs and chased them outside. I made it to the garage, heart pounding, certain I'd find a corpulent, weenie-wagging, leering, tattooed convict pointing a pistol at me from the driver's seat. But it was empty. I fired up the car and roared off the farm to the main road, where I nearly collided with the old Volvo station wagon wallowing around the last corner, Larry's frantic face pressed almost to the windshield. Somewhat irrationally, I was obsessed with the dogs, certain that they would be shot when Sensabaugh approached the house, and they ran, curious and friendly, toward him. I insisted on going back. When we got to the garage, Larry grabbed a shotgun and was about to make a tour of the house when we saw a scarecrow-like figure running awkwardly toward us along a fence row, a pistol in his downward-pointing hand. We froze in indecision and fear. At that cinematically perfect moment, the helicopter re-emerged from making a run along the river behind us and banked down so close that we could see the face of the pilot. With exaggerated arm motions, we semaphored him toward the approaching figure. Then, in a heroic Hollywood hurrah, a phalanx of cop cars topped the hill, going airborne, at least in my retroactive imagination, and maybe even in actual fact, heading toward the copse of trees into which the fugitive had disappeared. I had enough time after the deputies arrived to grab a little digital camera, and we stood on the porch watching the men getting out of their cars and walking with stunning nonchalance toward the trees. They amiably hollered to Sensabaugh, who was then hiding behind a tree, to give up and come on back. He was having none of it. And the next thing we knew, the men were scrambling back to their open car doors for cover as Sensabaugh opened fire. Dumbly, we stood there watching as the firefight continued until we realized this was the real thing, incoming. We ducked behind the porch columns. After more rounds came a moment of silence. Then we heard the tinnily distinguishable pop of a lone pistol shot from within the trees. It was a shot to the head. David Sensabaugh fell among the stumps and bracken of that untended copse. This man who was, for me, the boogeyman in the closet, the Callan-Wold, Hannibal Lecter, Perry and Hickok of my imagination. He bled out in the milky winter light as we all, the deputies included, stood silent and still. In the end, it turned out he was just a kid, my son's age, 19. Skinny, wet, cold, scared, exhausted, confused, and defiant, and dead in my front yard. When it was over, after the medical examiner and the ambulance teams had cleared out, we watched from the porch as Sensabaugh's hysterical mother was led back to her car, and the trucks, cars, television vans, and helicopter all took off. Then came a strange silence, a deep absence of something, and the farm grew still, as if beginning to heal itself. I walked over to the place where he died. The underbrush was matted down, patches of blue and orange spray paint marked coordinates of some kind. Yellow crime tape hung on the wild rose, and at the base of a hickory tree, a dark pool of blood glistened. I was tempted to touch its perfectly tensioned surface. Instead, as I stared, it shrank perceptibly, forming a brief meniscus before leveling off again, as if the earth had taken a delicate sip. Death had left for me its imperishable mark on an ordinary copse of trees in my front yard. Never again would I look out of my kitchen window at that lone cedar on the prow of hickory forest in the same way as I had before. I would never be free of the memory of what had happened there. But would a stranger, coming upon it, say, a century later, somehow sense the import of this place, the sanctity of this death-inflected soil? I chose to play the role of that stranger, but on different soil and much more than a century later, when I visited the Civil War battlefields in Virginia and Maryland, looking for the answer to that question, does the earth remember? Do these fields, upon which unspeakable carnage occurred, where unthinkable numbers of bodies are buried, bear witness in some way? And if they do, with what voice do they speak? Is there a numinous presence of death in these now placid battlefields, these places of stilled time? Some years before this trip, Neil Mackenzie, a friend, had sent me Wisława Szymborska's Reality Demands, a haunting wildflower at ground zero of a poem that looks on unblinkingly as life goes on at the world's most blood-soaked battlefields, Hastings, Borodino, Hiroshima. Quote, "There's a gas station on a little square in Jericho, while music pours from the yachts moored at Actium, and couples dance on their sunlit decks. The grass is green on Maciejewicza's fields, and it is studded with dew, as is normal grass. Perhaps all fields are battlefields, those we remember and those that are forgotten. There is so much everything," Szymborska wrote, "that nothing is hidden quite nicely." End quote. These lines, I decided, posed an artistic challenge that needed answering. 5 months after the shooting on our farm in May 2001, I drove to the battlefield at Antietam and spent the night. Just past dawn, I pulled my rolling darkroom into a far corner of a field by the Burnside Bridge. The grasses were pendulous with dew, and it took a hot spring sun to lighten them into an airy undulation. I watched it happen. The fields began to ripple like satin cloth flapping in slow motion, as each stalk, exuberant with seed, swayed in easy unison with its neighbors. I looked across those oblivious fields, sculpted by death, and thought the Bible is right. Surely the people is grass. I wasn't alone in having those thoughts before the death-hallowed ground of Antietam. Indeed, I had plenty of company. Busloads of tourists stood reverently looking out across the landscape. I'm pretty sure their thoughts, too, were about the power of death to transform the perfectly ordinary fields before them, looking like every other field they had passed on the interstate, into something profoundly moving. But in my case, and not just at obvious moments like this, standing before a field known for its carnage, I think about the underpinnings of death. What is wrong with me that when I see the great American plains beneath my airplane window, the mangrove swamps of Florida, or the rocky trails over which my horses gallop, all landscapes really, I invariably am reminded of the powdery bones shifting uneasily beneath them. And as well, the pale white skeletal bones of living humans, deep within a healthy body. I imagine them too. Among my father's collection of death iconography is a reproduction of a hanging scroll by the 19th century Japanese painter Kiyosai. In it, the eccentric 15th century Zen monk Ekkyu dances with joyous abandon on the head of a skeletal courtesan, as a conga line of smaller skeletons, one holding the skeletal ribs of a fan, weaves around the pair. This same Ekkyu is known for his cautionary and unsentimental appraisal of earthly love. Remember that under the skin you fondle lie the bones, waiting to reveal themselves. In these lines, Ekkyu forms an unlikely cross-cultural kinship with Flaubert, a writer I highly esteem. In a line of a letter from 1846 that Flaubert wrote to his longtime mistress, Louise Collet, he mirrors Ekkyu's mordant observation, quote, "I always sense the future. The antithesis of everything is always before my eyes. I have never seen a child without thinking that it would grow old, a cradle without thinking of a grave. The sight of a naked woman makes me imagine her skeleton," end quote. What's wrong with us? Is this a sign of mad despair? In Beckett's Endgame, the invalid Ham tells his servant a story about once visiting a friend in an insane asylum. Ham, in an attempt to cheer the demented friend, had dragged him to the window and cried, "Look, there, all that rising corn. And there, look, the sails of the herring fleet, all that loveliness." The madman turned back to his corner. Where Ham had seen loveliness, the madman saw ashes. But with me, I see both the beauty and the dark side of things, the loveliness of cornfields and full sails, but the ashes as well. And I see them at the same time, at once ecstatic at the beauty of things and chary of that ecstasy. The Japanese have a phrase for this dual perception, mono no Owari. It means beauty tinged with sadness. For can there be any real beauty without the indolic whiff of decay? For me, living is the same thing as dying, and loving is the same thing as losing. And this does not make me a madwoman. It makes me better at living, and better at loving, and just possibly better at seeing. After 2 trips to Antietam, my little greyhound Honey and I headed toward the thick cluster of Virginia battlefields in the Piedmont. Leaving behind our serene Shenandoah Valley and crossing the Blue Ridge, we drove through increasing urban sprawl, catching glimpses of battlefield markers sandwiched between the entrances to big box stores. Entering the governmentally protected battlefield sites, the physical remains of the war were immediately perceptible, far more than they were at Antietam. At Fredericksburg, I found a lead mini-ball, flattened, deformed, and dusted with white oxidation, and the sinuous earthworks of Spotsylvania Courthouse still wove through the fields, so well preserved that they appeared serviceable for the next Civil War, which, as I write this, given our governmental disarray, seems no longer inconceivable. Walking around the beautiful undulations, I thought how death had been the sculptor of this ravishing landscape, how beneath my feet shifted the bones of bodies, now the dark matter of creation, the rich earth. Summer was full on by then, and the heat and bugs and furious humming of the locusts were oppressive. So we retreated with the camera into the woods, which were curiously sparse. The trees seemed retarded in their growth, unconfident. Oaks were spindly, the Scotch pine poorly needled. These had to be the great-grandbabies of the trees that stood during the Civil War, but still they seemed sickly, as if the hot metal embedded in their ancestors had weakened the saplings as they struggled up through the lead-poisoned soil. In the late afternoon, my favorite time for shooting, we left the woods and went back out into the fields, empty now of tourists. Deep in the shadows of a luxuriant climbing grape that romped over the cedars, I watched as Honey dug into the cool dirt for a place to sleep. The smell of that soil came up to me, the smell of thousands of years of wars and killing, the smell of millions of bodies sown and plowed under. All part of the land, part of the earth I was breathing, the creamy smell of the feminine force in the world. That force is death, the dark, damp creator of life, the mother who nourishes us and by whom we are, in time, consumed. While Honey slept, I photographed in the waning light the lumpen shape of the vine-covered cedars looming monstrously over me. And when there were finally no more pictures, I set up the tent and scooped up the remaining handful of ice from the cooler for a strong gin and tonic. Honey ate her supper, then curled next to me. We lit the lantern, and I stared down from the high verge at a field nourished by the fallen. It seemed their spirits were drifting up with the ground fog that rose toward me. Wispily, it wrapped around the tent in the eerie eventide hour as I extinguished the lantern and my pup and I bedded down for the night. Lying on my stomach with the tent flap up, I thought of the men for whom these fields and those distant mountains were the final vision for their closing eyes. The earth took those men in its loamy embrace, their dumb demands for remembrance, acknowledged by the green fields returning each spring. The air was fragrant where I lay. It smelled of dirt and of grass, the eternal life of the dead. Yeah. Thanks.